The October evening air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves as 17-year-old Ethan Matthews clipped the familiar red leather leash to his golden retriever's collar. Max, a 3-year-old bundle of energy with a coat that gleamed like burnished copper in the fading sunlight, wagged his tail enthusiastically at the prospect of their daily walk. It was October 14, 2018, and the routine they had established over the past 2 years was as predictable as clockwork. Every evening at 6:30, regardless of weather, Ethan and Max would disappear into the network of trails that wound through the dense forest preserve behind their home in Millbrook, Vermont. Ethan's mother, Janet Matthews, was preparing dinner in the kitchen when she heard the familiar jingle of Max's collar tags and the sound of the back door closing. She glanced at the clock on the microwave, noting the time as 6:28 p.m., and smiled at her son's consistency. Ever since they had moved to this rural area 3 years ago, Ethan had embraced the outdoor lifestyle with an enthusiasm that surprised his parents. The boy who had once spent hours playing video games in their Chicago apartment had transformed into an avid hiker who could identify bird calls and knew every trail within a 5-mile radius of their home. The Matthews family had relocated to Vermont when Ethan's father, Robert, accepted a position as head of engineering at a renewable energy company based in Burlington. The transition from city to rural life had been challenging for all of them initially, but Ethan had adapted more quickly than anyone expected. He had joined the cross-country team at Millbrook High School, made friends with classmates who shared his newfound love of the outdoors, and had even begun talking about studying environmental science in college. Max had been Ethan's companion through this transformation. The Golden Retriever had been a rescue dog adopted from a shelter in Burlington when the family first moved to Vermont. The connection between boy and dog had been immediate and profound. Max seemed to sense Ethan's moods, providing comfort during the difficult adjustment period and boundless enthusiasm for exploring their new surroundings. Their evening walks had become a sacred ritual, a time for both of them to decompress from the day and enjoy the peaceful solitude of the forest. The trail system behind the Matthews home was part of the Millbrook Forest Preserve, a 1,000-acre protected area that offered hiking paths ranging from easy nature walks to challenging mountain climbs. Ethan typically chose the moderate trail that formed a 3-mile loop through mixed hardwood and pine forest, a route that took approximately 90 minutes to complete at a leisurely pace. The trail was well-marked and maintained, popular with local hikers but rarely crowded, especially during weekday evenings as autumn daylight grew shorter. Janet expected Ethan and Max to return by 8 o'clock, their usual time frame for the evening loop. When 8:15 passed without the sound of Max's collar jingling through the back door, she felt the first stirrings of concern. Ethan was meticulously punctual, a trait that had developed along with his love of outdoor activities. He understood the importance of letting others know his whereabouts and expected return times, especially as the days grew shorter and darkness came earlier. By 8:30, Janet's concern had escalated to worry. She stepped onto the back deck and called Ethan's name toward the forest, listening for any response or the sound of Max barking in acknowledgement. The only answer was the distant hooting of an owl and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. She tried calling Ethan's cell phone, but the call went directly to voicemail. Cell service in the forest preserve was notoriously spotty, so the lack of response wasn't necessarily alarming, but it added to her growing anxiety. Robert Matthews arrived home from work at 8:45 to find his wife pacing the kitchen with obvious distress. When Janet explained that Ethan and Max were nearly an hour overdue from their walk, Robert's engineer mind immediately began calculating possibilities. He knew the trail system almost as well as his son did, having hiked many of the routes himself during weekend family outings. An hour delay could mean many things. Ethan might have encountered injured wildlife and stopped to help. He could have met other hikers and lost track of time. Or Max might have chased something off the trail, requiring extra time to locate and retrieve the dog. Robert decided to follow the trail himself, armed with a powerful flashlight and his own cell phone. He was familiar enough with Ethan's preferred route to track it even in darkness, and he hoped to encounter his son somewhere along the loop, perhaps walking slowly due to Max being tired or distracted. The trail began just 50 yards behind their house, marked by a wooden sign that provided information about the preserve and reminded hikers to stay on designated paths. As Robert entered the forest, he called Ethan's name regularly, pausing to listen for responses. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar markers and trailblazes that Ethan would have followed. The path was clear and showed recent foot traffic, though in the darkness it was impossible to determine whether any of the tracks belonged to his son or his dog. 20 minutes into his own hike, Robert reached the halfway point of the loop where the trail crossed a small wooden bridge over Beaver Creek. This was one of Ethan's favorite spots, a place where he often stopped to let Max drink from the stream and to observe the wildlife that came to the water in the evening. Robert called out again, his voice echoing off the surrounding trees, but received no response. He continued along the trail, growing more concerned with each passing minute. Robert completed the entire 3-mile loop without finding any trace of Ethan or Max. When he returned home at 10:15 p.m., nearly 2 hours after Ethan's expected return time, he and Janet made the decision to contact the Vermont State Police. The dispatcher who took their call was sympathetic but initially reassuring. Teenagers sometimes lost track of time, especially when accompanied by energetic dogs who might lead them off established trails in pursuit of interesting scents or sounds. However, when Janet described Ethan's personality and his unwavering punctuality regarding their evening routine, the dispatcher's tone became more serious. A missing person report was filed, and Trooper Sarah Collins was dispatched to the Matthews home to begin a preliminary investigation. Collins arrived at 10:45 p.m., and her first step was to conduct detailed interviews with both parents about Ethan's habits, mental state, and any recent changes in behavior that might explain his absence. The interviews revealed a picture of a well-adjusted teenager who was thriving in his environment. Ethan was a senior at Millbrook High School with a B+ average, planning to attend the University of Vermont the following fall to study environmental science. He had a steady girlfriend, Emma Pierce, whom he had been dating for 8 months. His relationship with his parents was strong, and he had never exhibited any signs of depression, anxiety, or desire to run away from home. Trooper Collins asked about Ethan's experience level in the forest and his typical safety precautions. Robert explained that his son was an experienced hiker who always carried a small backpack with water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and an emergency whistle. Ethan understood the potential dangers of hiking alone, but had been walking the same route for 2 years without incident. Max was well-trained and typically stayed close to Ethan, though he might occasionally chase squirrels or other small animals for short distances. Collins requested a recent photograph of Ethan and a description of the clothing he had been wearing. Janet provided a school photo that showed a handsome teenager with brown hair and green eyes, and she described his typical hiking outfit: dark jeans, a gray hooded sweatshirt, and sturdy hiking boots. She also provided a detailed description of Max, including the distinctive red leather collar with brass name tags that contained the dog's name and the family's contact information. At 11:30 p.m., Collins called for additional resources to begin a night search of the forest preserve. The Vermont Search and Rescue Team was contacted, and volunteers were asked to assemble at first light for a comprehensive search operation. Collins also requested that the State Police K-9 unit respond to help track Ethan and Max's movements through the forest. The initial search began at 6 a.m. on October 15th, with over 30 volunteers from the local community joining professional search and rescue personnel. The operation was coordinated by Captain Dennis Morrison, a veteran of dozens of missing person searches throughout Vermont's wilderness areas. Morrison established a command post in the Matthews backyard and divided the forest preserve into grid sections that teams could search systematically. The K-9 units arrived early that morning and immediately began working from the Matthews back deck where Ethan and Max had last been seen. The bloodhounds easily picked up both scents, following them along the established trail toward the forest. The dogs tracked the familiar route for approximately 1 mile before the trail became confused near a section where multiple hiking paths intersected. At the trail intersection, the search dogs exhibited behavior that troubled their handlers. The animals circled the area repeatedly, whining and pawing at the ground, but seemed unable to determine which direction the scents continued. Officer Linda Chen, who had worked with search dogs for over 10 years, explained to Captain Morrison that this pattern typically indicated that the subjects had been picked up by a vehicle or had their scents masked by some other factor. However, the location where the scent trail ended was puzzling. The intersection was nearly 2 miles into the forest, accessible only by hiking trails with no vehicle access. It seemed impossible that Ethan and Max could have been picked up by a car or truck at that location. Chen suggested that unusual weather conditions, the presence of other strong scents, or the passage of time might have compromised the dogs' ability to track effectively. The search expanded throughout the day, with teams covering every trail, creek bed, and clearing within a 5-mile radius of where Ethan and Max had last been tracked. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the forest, looking for any sign of human or animal heat signatures. The thermal searches continued after dark, when body heat would be more easily detectable against the cool autumn air. After 3 days of intensive searching, the operation was scaled back to a monitoring phase. Over 200 volunteers had participated in the effort, covering more than 50 square miles of wilderness. Every known trail had been walked multiple times, every stream had been searched, and every abandoned structure in the area had been examined. Despite these exhaustive efforts, no trace of Ethan or Max had been found. Detective Lisa Rodriguez of the Vermont State Police took over the investigation as it transitioned from a search and rescue operation to a missing person case. Rodriguez had 15 years of experience with missing person investigations and brought a methodical approach that combined traditional detective work with modern investigative techniques. Rodriguez's first step was to examine Ethan's personal life for any factors that might explain his disappearance. She interviewed his girlfriend Emma Pierce, his closest friends at school, and his teachers and coaches. The interviews consistently painted a picture of a happy, well-adjusted teenager who was excited about his future plans. Emma reported that she and Ethan had made plans to attend homecoming together the following weekend, and he had seemed enthusiastic about the dance during their last conversation. The investigation revealed no evidence of drug use, depression, or any other issues that might motivate a teenager to run away. Ethan's academic performance had been consistent throughout his senior year, and his college applications were nearly complete. His bank account showed normal activity, with no large withdrawals that might indicate planning for an extended absence. His social media accounts revealed typical teenage interactions with no hints of problems or unusual communications. Rodriguez also investigated the possibility that Ethan might have encountered someone else on the trail that evening. She interviewed other regular users of the forest preserve, asking about any unusual activity or unfamiliar individuals they might have noticed around October 14th. The interviews revealed that the preserve was typically quiet on weekday evenings, with most hikers preferring weekend visits or early morning walks. One interview provided a potential lead. Margaret Walsh, a retired teacher who lived near the forest preserve, reported seeing an unfamiliar pickup truck parked at one of the trail access points on the afternoon of October 14th. The truck was dark-colored, possibly blue or black, and appeared to be an older model with damage to the rear bumper. Walsh had noticed it because the driver seemed to be watching hikers entering and leaving the forest, which struck her as unusual behavior. Walsh's description of the suspicious truck was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout Vermont and neighboring states. The description was also released to local media in hopes that someone might recognize the vehicle or have additional information about its driver. However, no one came forward with information that led to identifying the truck or its owner. As weeks passed without any developments, the Matthews family struggled to cope with the devastating uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their son and their beloved dog. Janet took leave from her job as a middle school teacher, spending her days coordinating with investigators and managing the social media campaign that friends had created to keep Ethan's story in the public eye. Robert continued working but found it difficult to concentrate on his engineering projects when his thoughts constantly returned to worrying about Ethan. The community of Millbrook rallied around the Matthews family, organizing fundraisers to support the ongoing search efforts and providing meals and emotional support. Ethan's classmates created a memorial display in the school hallway with photos and messages of hope for his safe return. The cross-country team dedicated their remaining races of the season to their missing teammate, wearing special ribbons with Ethan's name during competitions. As autumn turned to winter, the likelihood of finding Ethan alive in the forest diminished significantly. Vermont winters are harsh, and survival in the wilderness without proper equipment would be nearly impossible for extended periods. Detective Rodriguez shifted her focus to investigating potential abduction scenarios and examining whether Ethan's disappearance might be connected to other missing person cases in the region. The investigation revealed 2 other cases of missing hikers in Vermont over the past 5 years, though neither involved teenagers or dogs. In both cases, experienced adult hikers had disappeared while walking well-known trails, leaving behind no trace of their fate. The similarities between the cases were troubling, suggesting the possibility of a predator who specifically targeted people using remote hiking trails. Rodriguez worked with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to develop a profile of someone who might be responsible for multiple disappearances in wilderness areas. The profile suggested an individual who was familiar with the local trail systems, possibly someone who lived in the area or worked in outdoor recreation. The person would likely be comfortable in wilderness settings and might have knowledge of remote locations where victims could be hidden. The FBI analysis also suggested that if Ethan had been abducted, his youth and physical fitness might have made him a target for someone involved in human trafficking. This possibility led to an expansion of the investigation to include contacts with organizations that combat human trafficking throughout New England and Eastern Canada. As 2018 ended and 2019 began, the active investigation into Ethan's disappearance continued, but with fewer daily developments. Detective Rodriguez maintained regular contact with the Matthews family and continued to follow leads as they developed, but the case had effectively become a cold case waiting for new evidence or information. The first anniversary of Ethan's disappearance brought renewed media attention and a fresh wave of tips from the public. Vermont Public Radio featured the case in a special program about missing persons in the state, broadcasting interviews with the Matthews family and Detective Rodriguez. The program generated dozens of new tips, each of which was investigated thoroughly but ultimately led nowhere. During the anniversary coverage, the Matthews family made an emotional appeal for information about their son. Janet spoke about the difficulty of not knowing whether Ethan was alive or dead, explaining that the uncertainty was in some ways worse than grief because it prevented them from finding closure. Robert discussed his ongoing efforts to search remote areas of the forest preserve on weekends, hoping to find some clue that professional searchers might have missed. The second winter after Ethan's disappearance was particularly difficult for his family. The holiday season had always been important to them, but celebrating without Ethan felt impossible. They maintained his traditions anyway, placing his Christmas stocking on the mantel and setting a place for him at the dinner table, clinging to hope that he might somehow return. In March 2020, as Vermont began experiencing the early effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the investigation into Ethan's disappearance received an unexpected boost. The state's shift to remote work allowed Detective Rodriguez to dedicate more time to cold cases, and she began a comprehensive review of all evidence and leads in Ethan's case. Rodriguez's review identified several avenues that had not been fully explored during the initial investigation. She arranged for advanced DNA testing of trace evidence collected from the trail intersection where the K-9 units had lost Ethan's scent. She also coordinated with digital forensic specialists to conduct deeper analysis of Ethan's electronic devices and online activities. The DNA testing revealed genetic material from multiple individuals at the trail intersection, but most of it was too degraded to provide useful identification. However, the analysis did reveal one DNA profile that did not match any known hikers who used the trail regularly. This unknown DNA was entered into national databases for comparison with samples from other crime scenes. The digital forensics analysis of Ethan's phone and computer revealed that he had been researching wilderness survival techniques in the weeks before his disappearance. His browser history showed visits to websites about edible plants, water purification, and shelter construction. This discovery was initially concerning, as it might suggest that Ethan had been planning to disappear voluntarily. However, further investigation revealed that the research was part of a school project for his environmental science class. On October 8, 2019, nearly 1 year after Ethan's disappearance, a discovery was made that would provide the first concrete evidence about his fate. A group of hikers exploring a remote section of the forest preserve, approximately 8 miles from where Ethan was last seen, found a dog collar caught on a fallen tree branch. The collar was red leather with brass name tags, matching exactly the description of Max's collar provided by the Matthews family. The tags were tarnished and damaged but still legible, clearly identifying the collar as belonging to Max Matthews with the family's phone number engraved beneath the dog's name. The discovery of Max's collar was both heartbreaking and significant for the investigation. It provided the first physical evidence related to Ethan's disappearance and suggested that he and Max had traveled much farther into the forest than anyone had previously suspected. The location where the collar was found was in extremely remote terrain, accessible only by unmarked trails that required significant hiking experience to navigate safely. Detective Rodriguez immediately organized a comprehensive search of the area around where the collar was discovered. The search involved expert trackers, cadaver dogs, and volunteers familiar with the most remote sections of the forest preserve. The terrain was challenging, with steep ravines, dense undergrowth, and numerous fallen trees that created natural barriers and hiding places. The search around the collar discovery site revealed additional evidence that someone had been in the area recently. Investigators found the remains of a small campfire that appeared to have been used within the past year, along with fragments of camping equipment that had been damaged by weather exposure. Most significantly, they discovered a torn piece of gray fabric caught on a thorny bush approximately 50 yards from where the collar was found. The fabric matched the description of the gray hooded sweatshirt that Ethan had been wearing on the evening he disappeared. Laboratory analysis confirmed that the fabric was consistent with the brand and style of sweatshirt that Janet Matthews identified from Ethan's wardrobe. The discovery of both Max's collar and Ethan's clothing in the same remote area strongly suggested that both boy and dog had been in that location at some point after their disappearance. However, the condition and placement of the evidence raised more questions than answers. The collar appeared to have been caught on the tree branch naturally, as if Max had passed through the area and the collar had been pulled off by the vegetation. The fabric from Ethan's sweatshirt showed signs of having been torn forcibly, suggesting either that he had struggled through dense undergrowth or that he had been involved in some kind of physical altercation. The discovery prompted an expansion of the search to cover a much larger area of remote forest than had been examined during the original investigation. The new search area included terrain that was considered too difficult for a teenager to navigate safely, especially in darkness or adverse weather conditions. The fact that evidence had been found in such a remote location suggested either that Ethan was a more experienced wilderness traveler than anyone had realized, or that he had been brought to the area against his will. Forensic experts analyzed the campfire remains and camping equipment found near the collar and fabric. The fire had been built using proper wilderness techniques, suggesting that whoever created it had significant outdoor experience. The camping equipment included remnants of a high-quality sleeping bag and portions of a backpack that were more expensive and sophisticated than the gear Ethan typically carried on his evening walks. The analysis suggested that someone had established a temporary camp in the remote area and had remained there for several days or weeks. The location was ideal for someone who wanted to avoid detection, far from established trails, with access to fresh water from a small stream, and positioned in a way that provided early warning of anyone approaching from multiple directions. Detective Rodriguez began developing a theory that Ethan might have encountered someone who was camping illegally in the forest preserve. This individual could have been a drifter, a fugitive avoiding law enforcement, or someone involved in illegal activities who viewed Ethan as a threat to their security. The encounter might have led to Ethan being taken to the remote campsite, either voluntarily or by force. The investigation expanded to include a review of individuals who might have been living rough in Vermont's wilderness areas during the fall of 2018. Rodriguez contacted social services agencies, homeless shelters, and law enforcement departments throughout the region, asking about transients who might have been camping in forest areas. This line of investigation revealed several individuals who were known to camp illegally in wilderness areas, but most had solid alibis for the time period when Ethan disappeared. However, one name that emerged was concerning: William Cotter, a 45-year-old man with a history of violent crimes who had been released from prison just 3 months before Ethan's disappearance. Cotter had been convicted of assault and robbery in 2015 and had served most of his sentence before being released on parole in July 2018. His parole officer had lost contact with him in late September, just weeks before Ethan's disappearance. Cotter was known to have wilderness survival skills learned during military service, and he had previously been arrested for camping illegally in state and national forests. The search for William Cotter became a priority for investigators. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout New England, and his information was entered into national databases for wanted fugitives. A warrant was issued for his arrest on parole violation charges, providing legal justification for taking him into custody for questioning about Ethan's disappearance. In January 2020, Cotter was located and arrested in Maine, where he had been living under a false name and working at a logging camp. When taken into custody, he was found to be in possession of camping equipment that matched items discovered at the remote campsite where Ethan's clothing and Max's collar had been found. During questioning, Cotter initially denied any knowledge of Ethan's disappearance. However, when confronted with evidence linking him to the remote campsite, he eventually admitted to being in the area during the fall of 2018. Cotter claimed that he had been camping illegally to avoid his parole officer and that he had never encountered Ethan or Max in the forest. Detective Rodriguez was skeptical of Cotter's denials, particularly given his history of violence and his possession of equipment that matched evidence from the crime scene. However, despite extensive questioning and investigation, no direct evidence could be found linking Cotter to Ethan's actual disappearance. The case remained officially unsolved, though Cotter was returned to prison for violating his parole. The Matthews family struggled with the mixed emotions of having a suspect in custody, but no definitive answers about their son's fate. The discovery of Max's collar and Ethan's clothing had confirmed their worst fears that something terrible had happened, but it had not provided the closure they desperately needed. As 2020 continued, the COVID-19 pandemic limited the ability to conduct large-scale searches, but Detective Rodriguez continued working the case whenever possible. She maintained regular contact with the Matthews family and continued to follow leads as they developed, though significant breakthroughs became increasingly rare. In the summer of 2021, hikers discovered additional human remains in a remote ravine approximately 2 miles from where Max's collar had been found. DNA testing confirmed that the remains belonged to Ethan Matthews, finally providing definitive answers about his fate nearly 3 years after his disappearance. The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine the exact cause of death, but their location and positioning suggested that Ethan had died sometime during the winter following his disappearance. Whether his death was the result of exposure, accident, or violence could not be determined from the physical evidence. The discovery of Ethan's remains brought both closure and renewed grief to his family. Janet and Robert Matthews finally had definitive answers about their son's fate, but they also had to confront the reality that he had died alone in the wilderness, far from home and family. The fact that Max's body was never found added another layer of mystery and sadness to the tragedy. William Cotter remained the primary suspect in Ethan's death, though insufficient evidence prevented prosecutors from filing charges. Cotter was serving time for parole violations and other crimes, but he continued to deny any involvement in Ethan's disappearance or death. The case was officially classified as a homicide, but it remained unsolved in terms of prosecuting anyone for the crime. Detective Rodriguez retired from the Vermont State Police in 2022, but she never stopped thinking about the Ethan Matthews case. She had developed a personal connection with the family and felt responsible for finding justice for their son. Even in retirement, she continued to review the case file periodically, hoping that new evidence or technological advances might eventually lead to a prosecution. The Matthews family established a memorial scholarship in Ethan's name for students planning to study environmental science. They felt that honoring his passion for the outdoors and conservation was the best way to ensure that his memory would continue to inspire others. The scholarship has helped dozens of young people pursue education in environmental fields, carrying forward Ethan's love of nature and dedication to protecting wilderness areas. The forest preserve where Ethan disappeared remains a popular destination for hikers and nature enthusiasts. A small memorial marker was placed near the trail intersection where his scent had been lost, serving as a reminder of the young man who loved these woods and the loyal dog who accompanied him on his final walk. For the hiking community in Vermont, Ethan's case serves as a sobering reminder of the potential dangers that exist even in familiar wilderness areas. His disappearance led to improved safety protocols for hikers, including recommendations for traveling in groups, carrying emergency communication devices, and informing others of detailed route plans and expected return times. The case also highlighted the challenges law enforcement faces when investigating disappearances in wilderness areas. The vast terrain, harsh weather conditions, and limited access can make searches difficult and evidence collection nearly impossible. Ethan's case has been studied by search and rescue organizations to improve techniques for finding missing persons in forest environments. Today, the red leather collar that once belonged to Max remains in evidence storage, a small artifact that provided the crucial first clue in solving the mystery of what happened on that October evening in 2018. The collar serves as a reminder of the bond between a boy and his dog, and of how that bond led investigators to finally learn the truth about their fate. The routine evening walk that should have lasted 90 minutes instead became a mystery that spanned more than 3 years and involved hundreds of searchers, investigators, and community members. Ethan's story continues to resonate with families throughout Vermont and beyond, serving as both a tragedy and a testament to the persistence of those who refuse to let missing persons cases remain forgotten. The forest preserve where Ethan loved to hike continues to provide peace and recreation for countless visitors, but for those who know his story, the trails serve as a memorial to a young man whose life was cut short just as he was beginning to discover his passion for protecting the natural world he loved so much.